She was the kind of woman people admired from a distance. Charlotte Winters had it all: power, success, and a reputation built on strength and control. She didn't believe in distractions, much less in love. But on one ordinary afternoon, everything shifted. Her luxury car broke down in the middle of an important day. Surrounded by assistants and executives, frustrated and under pressure, she laughed and said something that sounded like a joke. "If someone can fix this engine, I'll marry them." Everyone laughed with her, everyone except one man. His name was Luke. A quiet, humble mechanic most people didn't even notice. He stepped forward, took one look at the engine, and did something no one expected. But what happened after that wasn't just about fixing a car. It was about pride, vulnerability, and a connection that neither of them could have predicted. And what Charlotte tells him in the final moment is something you won't forget. If stories like this speak to you, go ahead and like this video, and make sure to subscribe, because the next story might just surprise you even more. Charlotte Winters had a presence you couldn't ignore. She walked like the world belonged to her, dressed with the precision of someone who didn't make mistakes. As the CEO of one of the most powerful automotive companies in the country, she was a symbol of excellence and control. Boardrooms went silent when she entered. Reporters watched every move she made. Her name was on magazine covers, her voice in keynote speeches, and her decisions shaped the future of the industry. But what most people didn't know, what no one ever dared to ask, was who Charlotte really was when the office lights went dark. Power was her armor, and success was the wall she built around herself. She made sure no one got too close. That afternoon was supposed to be like any other high-stakes day. She had a global presentation scheduled in under an hour. A multi-million-dollar deal was on the line, and international investors were flying in just to hear her speak. Every detail had been planned with military precision: her wardrobe, her words, her entrance. But life has a funny way of ignoring our schedules. As she stepped outside, heels clicking against the concrete, her car, a sleek, custom-made luxury model, sat quietly in the sun. She pushed the key fob. Nothing. No engine, no lights, not even the faintest hum. A ripple of confusion passed through her team. She tried again. Still nothing. Her assistant rushed to her side, face pale, phone already in hand. Charlotte kept her cool, but inside, she felt something rare: uncertainty. This wasn't just a car. It was a statement. It was part of her identity. Now, in the middle of her own company's courtyard, it refused to obey her. Mechanics were called immediately. Technicians from the executive garage ran over with their toolkits. But even after checking the usual systems, no one could figure out what was wrong. The clock was ticking. Each second felt heavier than the last. Charlotte folded her arms and stared at the car like it had betrayed her. Some of the staff whispered, careful not to be heard. Charlotte Winters, the woman who never cracked, now stranded by her own creation. Still, she didn't raise her voice or panic. Instead, she took a breath, looked around, and with a dry, sarcastic smile said, "If someone can fix this engine, I'll marry them." A few nervous laughs broke out among her team. It was clearly a joke, one of those rare moments when she let her sense of humor slip through. But the tension didn't fully lift. No one dared to respond, and the car still sat there in silent defiance. She turned her gaze back to the vehicle, her mind already trying to plan a backup solution. Maybe she could get a helicopter. Maybe they could delay the meeting by 15 minutes. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about being late. It was about control. Charlotte hated losing control. It reminded her of things she worked hard to forget, times when she wasn't the one calling the shots. This wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was symbolic. The queen of the asphalt, brought to a stop by the very thing she was supposed to master. And for the first time in a long time, she felt exposed. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Messages from the board, reminders from her assistant, and calls from the investors' representatives. Still, she didn't move. It was as if the broken engine had frozen time around her. More technicians showed up, scratching their heads, trying diagnostics, running cables and sensors. Nothing worked. Some looked embarrassed, others confused. She could tell none of them wanted to be the one to admit failure to Charlotte Winters. But they didn't have to. She already saw it in their eyes. They were out of ideas. The car wasn't going anywhere. Then, from across the courtyard, someone appeared. Quiet, unassuming. A man in a simple uniform, a bit of grease on his hands, his name tag partially faded. No one paid much attention to him at first. He didn't walk with urgency or try to push past anyone. He just stood there, watching the scene unfold, like someone observing a storm from a distance. His name was Luke. He'd worked in the lower garage for years, someone whose job was to fix the things no one noticed. And in that moment, he noticed everything. Charlotte didn't see him yet. She was still focused on the team around her, her frustration hidden behind a calm expression. But Luke saw her. Not the CEO, not the title, not the headlines. Just her, a woman in an impossible moment, pretending not to care that her whole image was cracking. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission. He just started walking toward the car. One step at a time, slow and steady. The people around the vehicle moved aside without realizing why. There was something about his presence, quiet, but certain. No one knew what Luke would do. Not yet. Not even Charlotte. And that made what happened next all the more unexpected. Luke had worked for Winters Motors for nearly 8 years, tucked away in a corner of the underground service bay where few people ever went. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seek attention. He showed up on time, did his job with care, and disappeared when the day was done. To most people in the building, he was just the guy from the garage. But to those who paid attention, which weren't many, he was more than just a mechanic. Luke had a mind built for machines. He could hear problems before they started, fix things without needing a manual, and often made quiet suggestions that others claimed as their own. But he never fought for credit. He didn't like the spotlight. He liked engines. They didn't lie. On that particular day, Luke had been working on an older company truck when the noise began outside. He could hear people talking louder than usual, some running, others calling out orders. That wasn't normal. He walked up the garage steps and looked through the glass toward the central courtyard. That's when he saw her, Charlotte Winters, standing tall, surrounded by her team, staring down at a luxury car that refused to cooperate. It was a strange thing, seeing someone so composed in a situation she couldn't control. But she didn't panic. She stayed calm. Still, Luke could feel the pressure radiating from the crowd around her. No one seemed to have a solution. Not even the top engineers. As Luke watched, he wiped his hands with a rag and leaned against the railing, trying to understand what was going on. One of the technicians opened the hood again. Another was checking connections on a tablet. It all looked very official, very expensive, but still, no result. Then Charlotte, standing with arms crossed and a look of half amusement, half frustration, said something that carried across the courtyard. Her voice wasn't loud, but the silence around her made the words ring out clear. If someone can fix this engine now, I'll marry them. People laughed. Not just a chuckle, actual laughter. It was the kind of tension-breaking moment leaders use to keep everyone calm. But to Luke, it wasn't funny. He didn't laugh. He didn't smirk or shake his head. He just stood there, thinking. Something about the moment struck him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't the joke itself, it was the way she said it. Like part of her actually meant it. Not literally, of course. But maybe there was something deeper behind the words. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was loneliness. Or maybe it was hope in disguise. Luke didn't pretend to understand people the way he understood machines. But he knew when someone was reaching for something without saying it out loud. And in that moment, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He tossed the rag aside, walked back to his tool bench, grabbed a small kit he had built himself, and made his way up the side entrance of the building toward the courtyard. No one called him. No one noticed. He passed by people who didn't even glance in his direction. That was how it always was. Luke had become a ghost in his own company. Not because he didn't matter, but because no one ever stopped to see him. And he had stopped expecting them to. But today felt different. Not because he thought he'd get rewarded. Not because he took the marriage comment seriously. But because he knew he could help. And that was enough. As he stepped into the courtyard, the sun hit his face, and the noise of the crowd grew louder. But as he got closer to the car, something strange happened. People moved without realizing it. They stepped aside. Not because they knew who he was, but because of the way he moved. Confident, calm, without hesitation. One of the senior engineers turned and looked at him like he was out of place. "Can I help you?" the man asked, clearly annoyed. Luke didn't answer right away. He simply nodded toward the open hood and said, "I'd like to take a look." The engineer scoffed but didn't stop him. Charlotte hadn't noticed him yet. She was on a call, her back turned. Luke walked around the car slowly, observing it like he was reading a story only he could see. He noticed the tension in the wiring, the angle of the battery mounts, the way the sunlight reflected off the chrome in a way that revealed subtle heat damage. Details others might miss. He crouched down near the front wheel, adjusted something manually, and opened a small panel under the dashboard. A loose connection. A shorted wire. He made the repair without a word, using tools he brought from his own bench. It took less than 2 minutes. When he stood back up, Charlotte had just ended her call and finally turned around. She saw Luke standing there, grease on his hands, his shirt slightly stained, eyes focused. For a second, she looked confused. "Who are you?" she asked, not with judgment, just surprise. Luke gave a small nod and said, "Luke, from the lower garage." The name didn't mean anything to her. But before she could respond, he reached into the car, turned the ignition key, and the engine roared to life, smooth, steady, perfect. Everyone froze. The same people who had been laughing earlier now stood in stunned silence. Charlotte's eyes widened. She blinked once, then looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. The courtyard remained quiet for several long seconds. No one knew what to say. Luke stepped back, wiped his hands again, and gave a small smile, not cocky, just real. Charlotte slowly walked over to the car, still processing what had just happened. "What did you do?" she asked. Luke shrugged. "Just fixed what was missing." It wasn't the most technical answer, but it didn't need to be. Because in that moment, everyone knew something strange had just happened. Not just a mechanical fix. Not just a clever repair. Something else. Something that none of them could quite explain yet. And as Charlotte stood there, staring at the car, then back at Luke, she suddenly remembered her own words, the words that had made everyone laugh. But now, for reasons she didn't understand, the memory didn't feel funny anymore. Luke stood still for a moment after the engine roared back to life, letting the hum speak for itself. The group around the car slowly turned toward him, some with raised eyebrows, others with jaws slightly dropped. He didn't puff his chest or look for applause. He just took a step back and gave the space to Charlotte. The engine purred perfectly, a sound that meant control had been restored. Charlotte stepped closer to the car, her eyes shifting from the dashboard to the mechanic standing beside it. Her mind was spinning, trying to catch up with what had just happened. This man, whoever he was, had done in minutes what her top engineers couldn't manage in an hour. At first, people thought it was a fluke. Someone whispered, "He must have just gotten lucky." Another said, "Probably tightened something the rest of us missed." But deep down, even they knew better. Luke's movements weren't the kind of thing you fake. They came from years of doing the work, feeling it in your bones. There was nothing lucky about what he'd done. Charlotte's sharp gaze turned to him, searching for something in his expression, ego, pride, attitude, but it wasn't there. He just stood calmly, as if he'd changed a tire instead of saved the day. That's when she realized he wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't trying to prove anything. She stepped toward him, her heels echoing softly against the pavement, the engine still rumbling behind her. "What's your name again?" she asked, her tone quieter now, more curious than commanding. Luke met her eyes for the first time and replied, "Luke, from the lower garage." Something in his voice was steady. Not nervous. Not cold. Just honest. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to place him in her memory, but couldn't. That didn't bother him. He hadn't expected her to know who he was. Still, the moment between them felt different. Something shifted, though neither of them could name it yet. The people around them were starting to move again, pretending to check their phones or talk among themselves. But their attention never really left the pair at the center. Charlotte glanced back at the car, then looked again at Luke. She wasn't sure what surprised her more, that he had fixed it, or that she somehow felt the urge to thank him. And that wasn't something she did often. Gratitude in her world was usually reserved for boardrooms and performance reviews. Not courtyard miracles. "You just saved me a disaster," she said quietly. Luke gave a half smile, soft and simple. "Glad I could help," he replied. Then, with the meeting time ticking down and a team of executives already waving from across the lot, Charlotte knew she had to go. But something about walking away without acknowledging what just happened felt wrong. As she turned, Luke took a step back, giving her room. And then he said it, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for her to hear. "Good luck with the meeting, Ms. Winters." The way he said it caught her off guard. There was no sarcasm, no hidden meaning. Just a calm wish from someone who expected nothing in return. That was rare. And it stayed with her longer than she expected. She nodded once, unsure of what else to say, then continued toward her team. As she walked, her mind replayed the scene over and over. The simplicity of it. The timing. The quiet confidence of a man no one noticed. Her heart didn't race, but it beat in a new rhythm, curious, unsettled. She didn't usually think twice about encounters like this. But something about Luke's presence felt different. Like he saw her, not just the title. Not just the designer coat and the power suit. And for someone used to being in control, that was oddly disarming. She didn't like surprises, but this one didn't feel like a threat. Back at the car, Luke watched her disappear into the crowd of assistants and advisors. He didn't expect her to look back, and she didn't. That was fine. He hadn't done it for attention. He had done it because it needed to be done. Still, as he returned to the garage, something felt different in his steps. Not lighter, but not heavy either. Balanced. He wasn't sure if he'd ever see her again. Probably not. She was in a different world, and he had work to finish. But even as he returned to the shadows of the garage, he couldn't help but wonder what she had seen in him, and whether it mattered. Charlotte stepped into the boardroom 20 minutes later, her presentation polished and precise. Investors leaned in, captivated by her usual brilliance. But somewhere in the middle of her pitch, she caught herself thinking about grease-stained hands and steady eyes. She quickly brushed the thought away and returned to her flow. But the image didn't fade. She'd built her career on staying focused, shutting out distractions, and keeping emotions under lock and key. But sometimes, it's not the loud moments that shift a person. It's the quiet ones. The kind that sneak past all the walls. And just like that, something small had changed. Neither of them realized how big it would become. The meeting had gone better than Charlotte could have hoped. Investors signed, shook hands, and left the room buzzing about the future. Her team was thrilled, some already popping open bottles to celebrate. But while everyone else focused on champagne and spreadsheets, Charlotte's mind kept drifting back to the garage. She couldn't shake the image of that quiet mechanic, the way he looked at her without flinching. Something about that moment kept tugging at her, like a thread she didn't mean to pull, but couldn't stop. She tried to dismiss it. She had bigger things to focus on. But curiosity has a way of slipping through even the strongest walls. That evening, alone in her office, she opened her laptop and typed one name into the internal system, Luke. It brought up a short profile. No photo. Just a file with a few performance reviews and a job history that stretched nearly a decade. She clicked through the records, expecting something ordinary. But as she scrolled, something caught her attention. Notes about proposals he'd submitted. Innovations in engine efficiency, alternative fuel tech, even safety system improvements. Most had been marked as not applicable or already under review. A few were strangely similar to ideas currently credited to mid-level managers. That made her pause. The deeper she dug, the more puzzled she became. Luke had quietly submitted ideas for years, often with detailed diagrams and clear logic. But they were either ignored or buried. Some were even implemented months later by other departments, with no credit to him. That didn't sit right with Charlotte. She had built her empire on innovation, and on giving talent a real shot. She hated corporate politics, and she hated wasted potential even more. Closing the laptop, she made a decision. She wouldn't send an email. She wouldn't go through HR. She'd talk to him directly. This wasn't something she could delegate. The next morning, Luke was working under the hood of a hybrid prototype when he saw a pair of designer heels stop beside him. He wiped his hands and stood, surprised to see Charlotte Winters herself in the garage. She didn't say much at first, just looked at him for a moment like she was still piecing something together. Then, calm and direct, she asked if they could speak privately. Luke hesitated, not out of fear, but because it was unexpected. No executive had ever walked into his world before. Still, he nodded, wiped the grease from his hands, and followed her into a nearby conference room. Inside, she didn't waste time. She told him she'd reviewed some of his work. She didn't sugarcoat it. She admitted that what she saw was both impressive and disappointing. Impressive because his ideas had real merit. Disappointing because they were buried, ignored, or worse, taken. Luke listened without interrupting, his arms crossed loosely. He'd heard promises before. But something in her voice felt different. She wasn't pitching. She was offering. When she finally said she wanted him to join a new confidential innovation project, he blinked. Not because he didn't believe her, but because no one had ever invited him to the table before. He asked questions. He wanted to know who else would be involved, what kind of freedom he'd have, and whether he'd be expected to just nod along with upper management. Charlotte answered each question honestly. This wasn't a publicity stunt. She needed someone who thought differently. Someone who didn't come from polished schools or corporate playbooks. She needed someone who understood machines the way musicians understand notes. Luke said nothing for a long moment, his fingers tapping the side of his coffee cup. Then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll do it." Charlotte didn't smile right away, but there was a quiet shift in her posture. A tension that eased. She told him the team would meet off-site, in a space designed for freedom and real thinking. He wouldn't wear a badge. He wouldn't clock in and out. He'd have time and tools, and her full support. Luke still didn't know what to make of her. She was powerful, unreadable, and carried an energy that felt both intimidating and intriguing. But something in her approach made him believe this wasn't just about business. At least, not entirely. She saw something in him no one else had ever bothered to look for. Later that night, Luke sat in his small kitchen, staring at the invitation she'd printed for him. No email, just paper. He traced the company's seal with his thumb, thinking about what it meant. For years, he told himself he didn't need recognition, that doing the work was enough. But now he wondered if he'd just learned to live with disappointment. Charlotte had cracked something open. Not just an engine, but a door he never expected to walk through. And as the city lights blinked outside his window, he realized he'd already stepped in. But what he didn't know yet, what neither of them knew, was that this project would change more than just their careers. The new innovation lab was nothing like the rest of the company. It was a converted warehouse with open ceilings, exposed brick, and natural light streaming through wide windows. Charlotte had spared no expense to make it a space where ideas could breathe, and Luke noticed immediately. There were no stiff chairs or corporate posters, just machines, sketches, parts, and silence that invited thinking. For weeks, they worked side by side, speaking less than most expected but always communicating. She moved with sharp precision, like a strategist mapping a battle. He moved like an artist, fluid and instinctive. They couldn't have been more different, and that's exactly why it worked. But working didn't mean easy. Charlotte had high standards, and she pushed hard. She reviewed every schematic 3 times, questioned every calculation, and never accepted good enough. Luke, used to solving problems on the fly, found her perfectionism exhausting. He believed in getting things moving, fixing while in motion if needed. Their styles clashed often, sometimes loudly. But beneath the friction, there was something else building. When they weren't arguing, they were learning. When they disagreed, they still listened. And when they looked at each other, there were moments, small, quiet moments, where neither could look away. One Tuesday afternoon, while finalizing a concept for a modular battery system, things boiled over. Charlotte wanted a rigid framework to protect the cells. Luke argued it would limit airflow and overheat. The discussion turned sharp quickly, with voices rising and hands waving. Charlotte called his approach reckless. Luke called hers outdated. Then, Suddenly, he stopped mid-sentence and stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. "You hide behind control," he said, his voice lower now, but firm. "Because you're afraid of losing something that matters." The room fell into silence. Charlotte's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. She didn't back down. Instead, she took a slow breath, stepped forward, and replied evenly. "And you hide behind humility," she said, "because being noticed scares you. You're afraid if people really see you, they might expect something more." It wasn't said with anger, it was said with precision. And it landed. For a moment, the air between them thickened. Not with tension, but with truth. Two people who had spent years avoiding vulnerability had just called each other out in the middle of a workspace surrounded by tools, blueprints, and unfinished engines. Neither moved. Neither smiled. But neither looked away either. After that day, something changed. The arguments still came, but they didn't sting the same way. They became more productive, like sparks that didn't burn but welded something stronger together. Charlotte began asking Luke's opinion earlier, not just reviewing his work after the fact. Luke, in turn, started double-checking his own designs before submitting them, thinking ahead in ways he never bothered to before. They found a rhythm, not perfect but real. Their teamwork became less about compromise and more about chemistry. Everyone else on the project noticed, but no one dared say a word. Not yet. They started staying late more often. Not because they had to, but because neither wanted to leave. Some nights they'd talk about engines and materials. Other nights, about nothing at all. Music, childhood, regrets, dreams. Luke learned Charlotte used to draw cars in notebooks when she was 9. Charlotte learned Luke once rebuilt a motorcycle engine using spare parts from a junkyard, and it still ran. Those pieces of themselves slowly came to light, unguarded and unexpected. The lab no longer felt like a project site. It felt like a world they'd built together, piece by piece, without fully realizing it. Still, there was a line neither of them crossed. They kept it professional mostly. Their words never went too far, and their glances never lingered too long. But the current underneath everything was undeniable. One night, while reviewing a mock-up on his tablet, Luke leaned just a little closer than necessary. Charlotte didn't move. Her breath caught for a moment. Then she stood and walked to the coffee machine like nothing happened. That tension, the almost something, they both carried it, unspoken. It was like a song stuck between two notes, waiting for someone to finish the melody. And yet, Charlotte still fought the feelings rising inside her. She'd spent her whole life controlling outcomes, avoiding distractions, staying focused on success. She had no room for foolish things like feelings or flirtations. At least, that's what she told herself. But late at night, when she caught herself smiling at the thought of something Luke had said, or replaying the look in his eyes when they argued, she wondered if she was lying. And Luke? He didn't know what to make of her. She was a puzzle he couldn't fix with tools. A question he wasn't sure he wanted to answer. Then, one rainy evening, Charlotte walked into the lab and found Luke asleep at his workbench, surrounded by sketches and wires. Something about the scene, his quiet focus even in sleep, hit her differently. She stood there for a long time, watching him breathe, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the doorway. She didn't wake him. She didn't speak. But in that still moment, something shifted in her heart, and it terrified her. Because she wasn't sure if she was falling for him, or if she already had. It started with a glitch in the system, a file that wouldn't open, a schematic that had been edited but no one knew by who. At first, Charlotte thought it was just a tech error, something easy to fix. But then a second file disappeared. And a third. Security logs showed access from Luke's ID, but the timestamps didn't make sense. The prototype they'd worked on for weeks suddenly failed its first test, short-circuiting with a loud crack and smoke that filled the lab. Panic spread quickly. Whispers followed. And soon, trust began to fracture beneath their feet. Charlotte didn't want to believe it. Luke had never been careless, let alone dishonest. But the pressure was mounting. Investors were asking questions. The board was growing impatient. She reviewed every detail, rewatched security footage, questioned team members, but the evidence was thin, circumstantial at best. Still, the silence from Luke didn't help. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He just kept his head down, working late, saying little. And that silence started to sound suspicious to those around him. Charlotte felt the weight of every stare, every unanswered doubt. The worst part was how it all felt wrong. Deep down, she didn't think Luke could do something like this. But emotions had no place in decisions like these, or so she told herself. The company's reputation was on the line. So, after a tense meeting with the board, Charlotte made the call. She asked to speak with Luke privately. The conversation was short, cold, controlled. She told him he'd be suspended while an investigation continued. His eyes didn't flinch. He simply nodded. No anger. No explanation. Just quiet acceptance. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. Luke didn't take his things. He didn't pack a box. He just left. Like the wind disappearing after a storm. No words to the team, no emails, no confrontation. Just a single folded piece of paper left on Charlotte's desk. She found it that night, long after everyone had gone. The lab was quiet again, but in a different way this time, hollow. She unfolded the note with shaking hands. It read, "It's not enough to fix machines. Hearts need to be heard too." Nothing else. No signature. But she knew exactly who it was from. And exactly what he meant. Charlotte sat there for a long time, staring at that paper. Her mind ran in circles, trying to make sense of everything. She thought back to every late night, every quiet moment, every time Luke had looked at her like he saw the version of her she hid from everyone else. She wanted to believe in him. She did believe in him. But she had let the pressure win. She had let fear speak louder than trust. And now he was gone. And the lab, once full of energy and ideas, felt cold, empty, like something vital had been cut away. In the following days, productivity slowed. The remaining team moved cautiously, unsure of who to trust. Charlotte noticed it in their eyes: suspicion, unease, distance. Without Luke, the spark was gone. Meetings felt longer. Results were weaker. And she couldn't focus. Every time she looked at the unfinished prototype, she saw his hands working over it. Every time she glanced at the doorway, she half expected him to walk in with a new idea. She hated how much she missed him. And she hated herself more for not fighting for him when it mattered. But she wasn't ready to admit that out loud. Not yet. Instead, she poured herself into work, trying to fix the damage. She called in cybersecurity experts, reviewed backups, checked metadata. Bit by bit, she started piecing together a bigger picture. One that didn't quite add up to Luke being guilty. In fact, the more she looked, the more it pointed elsewhere. Someone with access, but also with motive. Someone who'd quietly discredited ideas before. Someone who'd always been threatened by anything Luke proposed. But Charlotte needed more proof before she could act. And time was running out. The board wanted answers. The investors were pushing harder. The team was losing morale. Charlotte was caught in a storm she didn't know how to escape. But beneath it all, a quiet determination began to grow. She'd made a mistake, maybe not in process, but in faith. And now she was ready to make it right. She didn't know if Luke would forgive her. She didn't even know where he'd gone. But she knew she had to try. Because losing him wasn't just about the project. It was about everything she'd never dared to admit she wanted. As rain poured outside the tall glass windows, Charlotte stood in the center of the lab and looked around. The place that once held so much potential now felt haunted by absence. But she didn't let it break her. Not this time. She picked up the note again, read it one more time, and placed it in her pocket. If hearts needed to be heard, she would listen. And maybe, just maybe, she would speak too. Not just as a CEO, but as Charlotte. As someone who finally had something to fight for, not just in business, but in life. The lab wasn't the same without Luke. The energy had drained out like air from a balloon, leaving behind an echo of what used to be. Charlotte walked through the hallways each morning, nodding at familiar faces, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The team moved slower, unsure of the direction, hesitant to speak up. The prototype sat untouched on the workbench, gathering more dust than ideas. She tried to lead like always, firm, focused, in control. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time in years, she felt uncertain. Not about the project, but about herself. Charlotte threw herself into the work, pretending the silence didn't bother her. But it did. It screamed in the quiet moments. Every report she read, every meeting she led, felt hollow. At night, she sat in her office, staring at Luke's note, playing those words over and over in her mind. Hearts need to be heard. It haunted her. Not because it was poetic, but because it was true. And she hadn't listened. She'd let fear and pressure drown out what she knew in her gut. That Luke didn't sabotage anything. That someone else had. She started digging quietly, without telling anyone. Reviewing system logs again, digging deeper into the access trails. She noticed odd overlaps. Someone had copied files under Luke's ID, but the timestamps matched another employee's login session. That someone had covered their tracks, sloppily, assuming no one would look twice. Charlotte cross-checked old emails, approvals, and even physical lab check-ins. A pattern started to form. One name kept popping up. Someone from upper management, someone who had once dismissed Luke's ideas and taken credit for others. Her stomach turned as the truth came together. It hit her hard. Luke had been framed. And she had walked straight into the trap without a second thought. She had believed what was convenient instead of what was right. That realization didn't just sting, it burned. She had always prided herself on being sharp, fair, unshakable. But now she saw how quickly she had abandoned someone she respected the moment things got hard. That betrayal wasn't just against Luke. It was against her own values. And it cut deeper than she ever expected. She felt ashamed. Not the kind of shame you shake off with a glass of wine or a long weekend. The kind that sits heavy in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. She thought about every time Luke had smiled in silence, offered help without asking for anything, shown up without fail. She had pushed all of that aside the moment doubt crept in. And now, she didn't know how to fix it. She didn't know where he'd gone. But she knew one thing for sure. He deserved better than what she gave him. The next morning, Charlotte skipped the board meeting. She didn't care about numbers or projections. Not now. Instead, she went straight to the security office, demanding full access to every log, every camera feed from the last 2 months. She spoke with IT, sat down with engineering leads, asked the uncomfortable questions. Slowly the truth came out. The trail led back to someone she had once trusted, a senior developer with ambition but no integrity. He'd used Luke as a scapegoat to cover up his own sabotage and mistakes. The confrontation was quiet, but final. Charlotte called the developer into her office, laid out every piece of evidence, and watched as his face drained of color. He denied it at first, then shifted blame, but she didn't flinch. She'd heard enough lies. He was fired on the spot, escorted out of the building. And yet, even after justice had been served, the empty chair across from her desk still haunted her. Luke wasn't back. Clearing his name didn't erase the pain she caused by not standing with him when it mattered. That night, she sat alone in the lab again, staring at the prototype they had once dreamed about together. The pieces were all there, but without Luke, it felt lifeless. She ran her hand over the metal, remembering how his voice softened when he explained an idea, how his hands moved like he was guiding the machine to breathe. Charlotte closed her eyes and whispered an apology he couldn't hear. But she meant every word. She wasn't sure if she'd ever get a chance to say it to him. But she knew what she had to do next. Charlotte stood up, took a deep breath, and grabbed her coat. The office was silent, the kind of silence that had weight. But she felt something stir in her, a spark of purpose. She was done letting guilt freeze her in place. If she had any chance of making things right, it had to start now. She didn't know where Luke was, but she would find him. Not just to clear the air, but to listen, to hear what she hadn't before. Because this wasn't about a prototype anymore. It was about truth. About connection. And maybe about something more. Charlotte drove without a destination until instinct took over. The streets blurred past, familiar yet distant, until she pulled up in front of an old building at the edge of town. It was quiet, almost forgotten, but she knew this place. She had seen the address in his file once, years ago, and something told her it was time. The garage looked worn down but not abandoned. The wide doors were open just enough to let in the late afternoon light, and inside, she saw him. Covered in grease, focused, calm. Like always. Like nothing had changed. Except everything had. She stood there for a moment, unsure if he'd notice her or if she should even speak. But the sound of her car door must have given her away. Luke looked up, squinting through the light. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just stared. She walked toward him slowly, not with the confidence of a CEO, but with the weight of everything she had learned. There was no clipboard in her hand, no agenda. Just honesty. He wiped his hands on a rag, saying nothing, waiting. And she stopped just a few feet away, heart pounding, unsure how to begin. "I was wrong," she said softly. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. "I didn't listen when I should have. I believed what was easiest instead of what was right. And I let you walk away without even asking for your side." Luke didn't respond right away. His eyes didn't narrow, but they didn't soften either. She took a shaky breath and went on. "I'm not here because of the board or the project or some corporate mess. I'm here because you mattered. You still do. And I don't want that moment to define who we are." The silence stretched. Luke turned away, setting a wrench on the table next to a half-built machine. She saw it now, a new kind of engine, sleek and unlike anything she'd seen before. Brilliant, of course. Just like him. She wanted to say more, but she'd said enough. This had to be his choice. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, looking at her in that calm, steady way of his. Finally he spoke. "Why now?" It wasn't bitter. Just real. She stepped closer, meeting his gaze. "Because I finally stopped pretending I had all the answers. And I'm tired of being right, if it means being alone." He studied her for a long moment, then slowly reached out, grabbing a clean towel and handing it to her. "You're gonna get your jacket dirty." She blinked, then let out a quiet laugh that surprised even her. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. But it wasn't rejection either. She took the towel. "Fair enough." Luke motioned toward the engine. "Wanna see what I've been working on?" She nodded, stepping beside him, closer than they'd been in weeks. It felt natural. Not easy, but right. He walked her through the design like he used to, his voice calm and patient, every line of the machine reflecting hours of work. She asked questions, not to impress, but to understand. He answered without showing off, just sharing like it used to be. They moved together in rhythm, their energy syncing up without effort. The walls between them were still there, but thinner now, almost transparent. In those quiet moments, surrounded by tools and possibility, something between them began to shift again. Not back to how it was, but toward something new. When the sun started to dip, Charlotte leaned against the workbench, watching him adjust a small component. "You ever think about coming back?" she asked carefully. "To the company? To the team?" Luke didn't answer right away. He tightened one last bolt and looked at her. "Only if it's not about proving anything. Not to them. Not even to you." She nodded, understanding. "No proving. Just building. Together." He held her gaze for a beat longer, then offered his hand. She looked at it, rough, calloused, steady, and took it without hesitation. The handshake wasn't formal. It wasn't a deal or an agreement. It was a restart, a reset, an understanding between two people who had messed up, grown up, and were willing to try again. No scripts. No walls. Just trust, still fragile but present. They stood there in the fading light, not saying much, but knowing this wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. A new chapter neither of them had planned for, but both had earned in their own way. Slowly. Honestly. Together. Later that night, as Charlotte drove back into the city, the road felt different. Wider somehow. Quieter but full of promise. She replayed everything that happened in that garage, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel haunted by regret. She felt grounded. Luke hadn't fully forgiven her, and she didn't expect that yet. But he had listened. He had looked her in the eye. And when he extended his hand, he didn't just offer a second chance, he offered hope. And she was ready to build something with it. The launch day arrived with the kind of buzz that only comes around once in a career. Reporters filled the hall, cameras flashed, and the energy was electric. The prototype gleamed on the stage under perfect lighting, and the crowd leaned forward, eager to witness something new. The presentation was flawless, every detail precisely as they had imagined during months of planning. But what truly caught everyone off guard was the emotion behind it all. Luke stood quietly behind the scenes, letting the machine speak for itself. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but the spotlight found him anyway. Charlotte stepped forward to speak, her voice calm but strong. She thanked the team, the investors, and the engineers, but then her tone shifted. Her eyes searched the crowd until they found Luke at the edge of the curtain. "Some engines," she said, pausing just long enough for silence to fill the room, "don't start because of technique or tools. Some start because someone believes it's possible. And someone has the heart to try. Luke taught me that." The room was silent for a second, then erupted in applause. But Luke didn't clap. He just stood there, stunned and smiling. After the cameras were gone and the room had emptied, they found themselves alone in the back hallway of the venue. The noise was replaced with a gentle quiet. Luke leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching her approach. She had changed out of her formal jacket, her hair slightly out of place, but her eyes sparkled with something unspoken. "You really meant what you said up there?" he asked softly. She nodded without hesitation. "Every word. I just wish I'd had the guts to say it sooner." They walked toward the parking lot side by side, steps slow and unhurried. The night air felt lighter, as if the tension that once stood between them had finally lifted. Charlotte glanced sideways, her voice a little playful now. "Do you remember what I said back when we were stuck on the road? About marrying whoever fixed that engine?" Luke laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Yeah. I thought it was just a joke." She stopped walking, turned to face him, and looked him dead in the eye. What if it wasn't? The words hung there, soft but heavy. Luke didn't answer right away. Instead, he searched her face for signs that she was teasing again. But there was nothing light in her eyes this time, only truth. He took a step closer, their shoulders almost touching now. "You're serious?" She nodded slowly. "I've never been more serious about anything." For a second, he seemed caught off guard. Then he smiled, that same quiet, steady smile she had seen the very first day. "Well, I've fixed a lot of things in my life. But you're the one thing I didn't know I was trying to fix." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat, and she reached for his hand, no longer trying to hide anything. He took it gently, as if it meant something more than just comfort. There was no crowd now, no headlines, no pressure. Just the two of them in a parking lot lit by soft lights and a long road ahead. She didn't need an answer tonight. It wasn't about rushing or forcing anything. It was about knowing, really knowing, that they had come through the fire and found something real, maybe even rare. They stood in silence for a while, neither wanting to break the moment. The wind tugged at her hair, and she tucked it behind her ear, still watching him. Luke finally spoke again, voice low. "You know, if that was a proposal, it's the kind of thing I'd never forget." She smiled, her eyes full of mischief now. "Was it?" He shrugged, eyes twinkling. "Guess I'll find out when you ask again." They both laughed, the kind of laugh that only comes from shared history and healed wounds. Whatever came next, they were finally on the same page. Back in the garage days later, the two worked in comfortable silence, tweaking a newer version of the prototype. The rhythm was different now, easier, deeper, more connected. She handed him tools before he asked. He anticipated her next move without needing to speak. There were no titles here. No CEO and no mechanic. Just two people building something together, not just with hands and minds, but with hearts that had finally found their beat. And as the motor whirred to life again, it sounded almost like a promise. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of what had just shifted in that small room. But something had. And though the world would see headlines and awards and innovation, the real story wasn't about machines. It was about trust, growth, and choosing to see the value in someone when no one else had. As the evening crept in, Charlotte closed her notebook and looked over at Luke, who was wiping grease from his fingers. "We're not done, are we?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He looked at her and grinned. "Not even close." A full year had passed since that unforgettable moment in the parking lot, and so much had changed. Charlotte Winters was no longer just the CEO known for her sharp mind. She was the visionary leader who had taken her company to places no one expected. And Luke? He was more than a mechanic now. He had become the face of innovation behind their boldest designs. Together, they weren't just leading a project. They were rewriting how things were done, from the boardroom to the workshop. Their partnership had turned into a quiet legend around the office. And yet, what meant most to them wasn't the success, it was each other. The latest model, codenamed Horizon, was set to debut in front of investors, press, and thousands of live viewers. It was sleek, powerful, and unlike anything the company had ever launched. While the world waited for the big reveal, Charlotte paced backstage, dressed in her usual sharp black suit, but with something hidden in her pocket this time. Her fingers nervously touched the small velvet box she had carried for weeks, waiting for the right moment. And tonight, under the lights and the roar of applause, she knew that moment had come. But she didn't want a spectacle. She wanted something real. Luke stood just a few feet away, double-checking the final settings on the display panel. Focused as ever, completely unaware. He had a smudge of grease on his sleeve, which made her smile. He hadn't changed. And that was what she loved. He still worked with the same hands-on energy, still spoke with that calm voice, still saw the world as a place full of possibilities, especially when no one else did. Charlotte took a deep breath, knowing this wasn't the time for her usual logic. It was a moment that needed heart. So she stepped closer and tapped him gently on the shoulder. He turned around, surprised to see her expression so serious. "Everything okay?" he asked, lowering his voice so the crew wouldn't overhear. Charlotte didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small box. Before Luke could react, she slowly knelt down on one knee, right there in the narrow backstage corridor. His eyes widened in disbelief, and she could see his chest rise with a deep breath. "This time," she said softly, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, "I mean it. Will you marry me?" Luke stared at her for a moment, completely stunned. The world outside kept moving, texts shouting, music playing, lights flashing, but between them, everything slowed down. He reached for her hand and held it gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since the day you made that old engine roar back to life," he said, "I've been yours. You just didn't know it yet." Charlotte felt a lump in her throat, something rare for someone so composed. She stood up slowly and he pulled her into his arms. No cameras, no audience. Just two people who had found something real in the chaos. After the presentation, the Horizon made headlines, but it wasn't the only thing people talked about. Rumors swirled. Someone had seen Charlotte kneeling backstage, others whispered about a ring, and a few swore they saw Luke smiling in a way he never had before. But neither of them confirmed anything. They kept it quiet, just like everything else between them. Because what they had didn't need flashing lights or corporate press releases. It was theirs. Simple, steady, and stronger than anything either had expected when they first met. Back at home, later that night, Luke tossed his jacket on the couch and turned to find Charlotte barefoot in the kitchen, pouring wine. The way she moved, relaxed and happy, made his chest feel full. "You sure about this?" he asked, watching her with a smile. She looked up and laughed softly. "I've made billion-dollar decisions with less certainty than I feel right now." He walked over, took the glass from her hand, and kissed her forehead. "Then let's build something even bigger. Not just engines this time, something that lasts forever." She rested her head on his shoulder, and the room fell quiet again. There were no blueprints for this, no user manuals or startup guides. But that was okay. They had learned how to work through chaos, how to trust, how to speak the truth even when it was hard. That was more than most people ever had. And as the city lights blinked outside their window, Charlotte knew this wasn't an ending. It was just another beginning. One powered not by design or data, but by something far stronger. Love at full throttle. In the morning, they'd be back in the office, facing deadlines, meetings, and new prototypes. But tonight they had this. A small ring in a velvet box. A quiet promise in the dark. And the shared understanding that after all the breakdowns, restarts, and unexpected turns, They had found the one engine that never failed. Each other. This story isn't just about engines, boardrooms, or innovation. It's about how two completely different worlds can collide, unexpectedly, and create something powerful. It reminds us that even the most complex machines are still moved by something simple: connection, trust, and the courage to be seen. Charlotte and Luke showed us that behind every brilliant idea, there's a beating heart. And sometimes, the greatest breakthroughs don't happen in a lab or a garage. They happen when two people choose to believe in each other. If this story has touched your heart, write in the comments, "Some engines run on fuel. The best ones run on love." We'd love to hear how this story made you feel, or which part of it stuck with you the most.